I had just moved into a beautiful new house, or at least it seemed beautiful, until I saw it, a dark, shifting figure standing motionless in the corner of my bedroom, every night at 3 a.m. But no matter how many times I looked away and looked back, it was always there. The day I closed the deal on my new house was one of the happiest days of my life. I had spent years saving every penny, working long hours, and enduring cramped apartments with thin walls and noisy neighbors. This house was everything I had dreamed of, a quaint, cozy place on the edge of a small town, surrounded by trees and bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. It was mine, and it felt like a fresh start. The first few days were blissful. I spent hours arranging furniture, unpacking boxes, and imagining the memories I'd create in this space. But the first night I stayed alone, something felt off. At first, I chalked it up to the usual jitters of sleeping in an unfamiliar place. The silence was so complete that every creak and groan of the house seemed magnified, but I told myself it was nothing. After all, old houses made noises. By the third night, the feeling of unease became harder to ignore. It wasn't the creaks or the groans that unnerved me, it was the sense that I wasn't alone. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone standing there, but there was never anything. Just the empty room and my overactive imagination. Then came the night when I first saw it. It was 3 a.m. when I woke up. I wasn't sure what had disturbed my sleep, a bad dream perhaps, though I couldn't remember any details. As I lay there, trying to convince myself to go back to sleep, I felt an inexplicable urge to look at the corner of my bedroom. That's when I saw it. A dark figure stood in the corner, motionless. It was tall and human-shaped, but its edges seemed to ripple as though it were made of smoke or shadow. My heart thundered in my chest as I stared at it, frozen with fear. I blinked, hoping it was just a trick of the light, but it didn't go away. It was still there, watching. I don't know how long I stared at it before I finally gathered the courage to turn on the bedside lamp. The light flooded the room, and the shadow disappeared. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. When I turned the light off, the figure reappeared, standing exactly where it had been before. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been a waking nightmare, the kind of hallucination that sometimes happens when you're half asleep. But deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong with this house. For the next few nights, I tried everything to keep the shadow at bay. I slept with the lights on, but it didn't help. The figure would still appear, darker than the shadows around it. I tried ignoring it, refusing to look at the corner of the room, but I could feel its presence, like a pair of eyes boring into me. Sleep became impossible. As the days went on, my life began to unravel. I was constantly exhausted, snapping at my coworkers and forgetting basic tasks. My friends noticed the change in me, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them what was happening. Who would believe me? Then came the night when the shadow moved. I had fallen into a restless sleep, only to wake up to the now familiar sight of the figure in the corner. But this time, it wasn't standing still. It was swaying ever so slightly, like it was breathing. My chest tightened as I watched it, and then it started to move toward me. I scrambled to turn on the lamp, my hands shaking so badly that it took me several tries to find the switch. The light filled the room, and the shadow vanished, but the damage was done. I couldn't stay in that room another second. I grabbed my blanket and fled to the living room, where I spent the rest of the night on the couch, the lights blazing. The next day, I decided to do some research on the house. I went to the local library and dug through old records and newspapers, hoping to find anything that could explain what was happening. That's when I found the article. 20 years ago, a woman named Margaret lived in the house. She had been a recluse, rarely seen by neighbors. One day, a mailman noticed a foul smell coming from the house and called the authorities. When the police entered, they found Margaret's body in the bedroom. She had been dead for weeks. Her cause of death ruled as suicide. But that wasn't the end of the story. Neighbors reported seeing strange lights in the house at night and hearing whispers when no one was there. Eventually, the house was sold, and its dark history was forgotten until now. That night, armed with this knowledge, I tried to confront the shadow. I sat in my bedroom with every light in the house turned off, clutching a flashlight like a lifeline. At 3 a.m., the figure appeared, as I knew it would. My heart pounded as I forced myself to speak. "Who are you? What do you want?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then the shadow shifted, its form becoming more defined. I could make out the faint outline of a face, its expression one of profound sadness. A chill ran down my spine as I realized it wasn't just a shadow. It was her, Margaret. Tears filled my eyes as I whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The shadow seemed to hesitate, its edges softening. For the first time, I didn't feel fear, I felt sorrow. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. I slept peacefully that night for the first time since moving in. The shadow never returned, but I'll never forget it. Margaret's pain had lingered in that house for decades, her story untold and her soul unrested. In acknowledging her, I had given her a small measure of peace, and in doing so, I had found my own. To this day, I can't walk past the corner of my bedroom without thinking of her. The house is no longer just a house to me. It's a reminder that we all leave behind shadows, some darker than others. And sometimes, those shadows just want to be seen. I thought I got a great deal on the antique mirror I found in the attic of my new home. But what I didn't know was that this mirror had once belonged to a family who vanished without a trace. When I bought my first home, I was ecstatic. It wasn't much a small two-story fixer-upper nestled in a quiet neighborhood, but it was mine. The kind of place where you could hear the hum of cicadas in the summer and the crunch of leaves in the fall. It felt like a new beginning. The house had stood empty for years, a time-worn relic of the 1920 seconds. It creaked and groaned in places, but it had character. Or so I told myself. One day, while unpacking, I decided to explore the attic. The narrow staircase leading up was hidden behind a door in the hallway, its hinges rusty from neglect. When I pushed the door open, a musty smell hit me, the kind that reminded me of old libraries. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight as I climbed the rickety steps. The attic was a treasure trove of forgotten history. Yellowed newspapers, faded photographs, and mismatched furniture scattered across the wooden floor. That's when I saw it. Tucked away in the corner, leaning against the wall, was a mirror. It was large, nearly 6 feet tall, with an ornate gold frame carved in intricate floral patterns. The glass was cloudy with age, the surface speckled with tiny black dots where the silver backing had worn away. Despite its condition, the mirror exuded an undeniable charm. It felt like something that belonged in a grand estate, not collecting dust in an attic. I couldn't believe my luck. After wrestling it downstairs, I cleaned it thoroughly, polishing the frame until it gleamed. It was beautiful. I decided to place it in my bedroom, opposite the bed, where it would catch the morning sunlight. That night, as I lay in bed, the mirror reflected the soft glow of my bedside lamp. It added a touch of elegance to the otherwise plain room, but as I drifted off to sleep, I felt it was as if the mirror's presence was too heavy, too alive. The nightmares started soon after. At first, they were subtle, disjointed dreams of shadowy figures and whispers I couldn't quite make out. I chalked it up to stress from the move. But then one night I woke up gasping for air. In the dream, I'd been standing in front of the mirror. My reflection wasn't my own. The face staring back at me was pale, gaunt, and covered in bruises. Its lips moved, but no sound came out. When I woke, my heart was pounding, and I found myself staring at the mirror, half expecting to see that face again. Things only got worse. One evening, as I was brushing my hair in front of the mirror, I thought I saw movement behind me. It was quick, like a shadow darting across the room. I spun around, but nothing was there. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the unease grew stronger. The mirror seemed to hum with energy, as if it were watching me. One night, I decided to test it. I sat in front of the mirror with a single candle flickering beside me. I stared into the glass, my own reflection staring back. At first, nothing happened. But then, the glass seemed to ripple, as if it were water disturbed by a pebble. My reflection's eyes darkened, and a figure appeared behind me. It was a woman, her face pale and her eyes hollow. She reached out toward me. I screamed and knocked the candle over. The flame extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for the light switch, my hands trembling. When I turned on the lights, the mirror was just a mirror again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had crossed over. Determined to find answers, I started researching the history of my home. What I found chilled me to the bone. The house had belonged to the Carter family in the 1922. They were a young couple with a daughter named Lillian. According to old newspaper clippings, the Carters vanished without a trace one summer night. Neighbors reported hearing screams, but when the police arrived, the house was empty. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no clues, just one. The mirror had been in their possession. A photograph from the newspaper showed the family standing in the parlor, the mirror visible in the background. It was unmistakable, the same ornate frame, the same cloudy glass. My unease turned to terror. I decided to get rid of the mirror. I carried it out to the garage, covering it with an old sheet. That night, I slept more peacefully than I had in weeks, but when I woke up the next morning, the mirror was back in my bedroom. My heart sank. I checked the garage, and sure enough, the spot where I had left it was empty. I tried everything. I gave it away to a local thrift shop, but the next day it was propped against my bedroom wall. I tried smashing it with a hammer, but the glass wouldn't break. It was as if the mirror refused to leave. And then, the whispers started. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible. But over time, they grew louder, more insistent. "Help us," they said. "Find us." The voices seemed to come from the mirror, their tone filled with sorrow and desperation. I couldn't ignore them any longer. I decided to confront the mirror. One night, I lit candles around the room and sat before it. I spoke aloud, asking who they were and what they wanted. The glass rippled again, and the reflection changed. This time I saw the Carter family, the father, mother, and little Lillian. Their eyes were wide with fear, their mouths moving soundlessly. Then, the scene shifted. I saw a man in dark clothes standing behind them, his face obscure. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The Carters hadn't vanished. They had been murdered. Their spirits were trapped in the mirror, unable to move on. And the man, he was still there, a shadow lingering in the glass, feeding off their fear. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't live like this, and I couldn't leave the Carters trapped in their torment. I reached out to a local historian and paranormal investigator named Margaret. She was an older woman with kind eyes and a wealth of knowledge about the supernatural. When I showed her the mirror, she didn't flinch. "This is a prison," she said. The spirits are bound to it. To set them free, we must break the connection. Margaret prepared a ritual involving salt, sage, and blessed water. We performed it together in my bedroom. As we chanted, the mirror began to shake violently. The glass rippled like water, and the whispers turned into anguished cries. The shadowy figure appeared again, its form twisting and writhing. Margaret threw a handful of salt at the mirror, and the shadow let out an inhuman scream before vanishing. The glass shattered, the fragments scattering across the floor. For the first time in weeks, the room felt light, peaceful. In the aftermath, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The Carters' spirits were free, but the weight of their tragedy lingered. I found an old cemetery where the family was buried and left flowers on their graves. It felt like the least I could do. As for the mirror, I kept the broken pieces in a box. Margaret advised me to bury them far from the house, ensuring the curse wouldn't return. I did so, laying the shards to rest in a remote forest. Life slowly returned to normal. The nightmare stopped, and the house felt like my own again. But every now and then, I catch myself glancing at reflections in windows, in puddles, in polished surfaces. And I wonder, did I really set them all free? Sometimes, late at night, I hear faint whispers in the wind. And though I try to convince myself it's just my imagination, a part of me knows better. Once you've looked into the world beyond the glass, it never truly lets you go. I had just bought my new home when I heard a baby crying from the attic. I rushed to check, but when I opened the door, there was nothing there, and the crying didn't stop. So I still remember the day I signed the papers for what I thought would be my forever home. It was a charming old Victorian house, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by towering oaks and an air of tranquility. The house had character, intricate woodwork, antique fixtures, and a wraparound porch that seemed to whisper stories of its past. Moving day was a blur of excitement and exhaustion. But by evening, I sat on the living room floor, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, sipping a cup of tea. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of settling wood. It felt peaceful, home. But that peace didn't last long. The first time I heard it, I thought I was imagining things. A faint, muffled sound, almost like crying. It was so faint that I dismissed it, chalking it up to the wind or my tired mind playing tricks on me. But over the next few nights, the sound grew louder and more distinct. It wasn't just crying. It was the unmistakable, heart-wrenching cry of a baby. It seemed to be coming from the attic. The first time I went up to check, my heart pounded in my chest. The attic was accessible through a pull-down ladder in the hallway. As I climbed, the crying stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence that felt heavier than the air. The attic was empty. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight, and old wooden beams loomed overhead. There was nothing there. No baby, no animals. Nothing that could explain the sound. I descended, feeling foolish but unsettled. The next few nights were worse. The crying became relentless, starting at midnight and lasting for hours. It sounded desperate, like a baby in distress. I barely slept, my mind racing with possible explanations. Maybe the sound was coming from outside, a neighbor with a baby, but the closest house was several hundred feet away, and the crying was too distinct, too close. One night, unable to take it anymore, I decided to thoroughly search the attic, armed with a flashlight and a resolve born of sleepless desperation. I climbed the ladder. The crying continued, even as I reached the attic floor. It felt as if the sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I started rifling through the clutter left behind by the previous owners. Old boxes, Faded furniture and cobweb-covered trinkets filled the space. As I moved a stack of boxes, I noticed something unusual: an old weathered diary. Its leather cover was cracked with age, and the pages were yellowed and fragile. I sat on the floor and began to read. One entry caught my breath. July 15, 1947. Clara's cries keep me awake at night. Richard says it's just colic, but I feel something off. She stares at the attic ceiling as if she sees something I can't. It frightens me. August 3, 1947. The fire. Oh God, the fire. We lost her. Clara was in the attic when it started. I can still hear her cries. They haunt me. The house feels heavy with grief. I can't stay here anymore. Tears blurred my vision as I closed the diary. The crying wasn't in my head. It was Clara. Her spirit was trapped in the attic, reliving her final moments over and over again. My heart ached for her, for Eleanor, for the unbearable loss they had endured. As if in response to my realization, the crying grew louder, more desperate. I whispered, "Clara, it's okay. You're not alone." My voice trembled, but I meant every word. The crying stopped. For the first time in weeks, the house fell silent. I descended the attic ladder, clutching the diary like a lifeline. That night, I dreamt of a baby's laughter and a woman's soft humming. It was almost comforting, but when I woke, an overwhelming sense of sorrow lingered. The following day, I did some research. The fire Eleanor wrote about was real. It had made the local papers in 1947, a tragic accident, they called it. But there were whispers of something more sinister. Some claimed the house was cursed, that it had a history of tragedy long before Eleanor and Richard moved in. I couldn't stay. The house, beautiful as it was, carried too much pain. I packed up and moved out within a week. As I drove away, I glanced back at the attic window. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure there, a woman holding a baby, watching me leave. Even now, in my new home, I sometimes hear faint cries at night. They don't last long, but they're enough to remind me. Clara's story will always be with me, a haunting reminder of a life cut tragically short, and a house that could never let go of its past.